Hey, folks. So we're here with anarchist playwright Brenton Langle, and we're going to have a discussion about the politics behind the two big Jesus rock operas, the 1970 rock opera Jesus Christ Superstar and the subsequent 1971 rock opera Godspell. Right? Both of them came out at a very pivotal time in U.S. politics. Both of them told the story of the life and passion of Jesus Christ. And they were extremely different from each other, but they spoke to something that was going on in the country and offered kind of a political insight. Now, I've got quite a bit to say on this, as does Brenton Langle. So, Brenton, you were telling me that Superstar was actually an inspiration to you in some of your writing.
Yeah, I saw Jesus Christ Superstar for the first time around like 2010. I saw the movie. I had actually been slated to be in a musical of Jesus Christ Superstar at my old job when I was working as a professional actor in Cincinnati, Ohio, but I left before that came up. So I didn't really get an opportunity to be in it, which is a shame because I think I would have been a pretty good Caiaphas. Those low notes I really could have hit. But yeah, so Jesus Christ Superstar. I watched it in my apartment in New York and kind of had a lot of things rattling around in my head at the time. This was before I became a Buddhist, but after I lost my faith as a Christian and became an atheist. And watching the film, I think like one of the things that I was most struck by was that the way it was framed at the beginning when it came in, where everybody comes in on the bus and everybody gets out and they put on their costumes, it's like they're getting ready for a show. And then, of course, at the end of the film, they come in and they pack everything up, and Jesus, the guy who plays Jesus, doesn't get on the bus. And we were laughing about it. Like my roommate was like, "Oh, it's like they took a guy out into the desert and killed him for a show," and my brain was like, "Oh my God." That's what they did.
Wow.
And then you started to see it, like, because I was looking at the Jesus story from a atheist perspective, but also like from the perspective of somebody that understood Christianity and the whole concept of a scapegoat. So I became really obsessed with the idea of sacrifice and religion, and this informed a play of mine that I wrote very quickly after called Berserker, which is set in Iceland in the year 997 and goes around a conflict between the Christians and the pagans and the creation of a berserker. And it pulls and specifically references the Jesus Christ story. And I think that play of mine, which is also a screenplay and will hopefully be a movie one day, would not have been written had I not seen Jesus Christ Superstar exactly when I saw it.
Well, what's interesting is, when you watch Jesus Christ Superstar, I saw Godspell first. I saw the play of Godspell at first, and then I remember seeing, the movie and then going to a stage production of Jesus Christ Superstar as a teenager. And I was kind of blown away because I felt like Jesus Christ Superstar was almost like, it would be like, now I look back on it and think, it would be like if Christopher Nolan, the Dark Knight Rises director, had been told to do the Jesus story, because it is the most dark, kind of scary. Like it's almost like, there's Batman of the 1950s, who's got Robin, who's always making the wild remarks, holy something, Batman. It's kind of cheery. Yeah. And Christopher Nolan takes, Batman becomes Batman. And it's like this dark. Yeah, it's this very, very, very dark version. And I feel like Jesus Christ Superstar is very much a dark interpretation of Jesus. Whereas as Godspell, which came later, is like Sesame Street almost. It's almost like like for children's television practically, even though it's for adults. But I want to put both of these in the proper political context. Yeah. Because you have to remember, so 1970 is when Superstar comes out. 1971 is when Godspell comes out. And at that point, the United States is gripped in the middle of a huge political crisis, right? The Vietnam War is continuing. The public is opposed to the Vietnam War. Anti-war demonstrations are everywhere. 1968, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., protests erupted in every major city in the United States. The National Guard is dispatched all over the country to fight against...
what's that like?
Yeah, to fight against a huge rebellion among the African-American community. The Black Panthers are very big and popular, and Nixon, of course, wins the election in a landslide, promising that he's the law and order candidate, and he's going to stop the rebellion and make people love their country again, and solve the political crisis. So in that atmosphere, you have to understand what was happening, right? So let's back up a little bit. The 1950s, right? So World War II. During World War II, we had a left-wing government. Roosevelt created all kinds of popular reforms. He was a big fan of labor unions. He was aligned with the Communist Party domestically. He was aligned with the Soviet Union, against the Nazis internationally. Roosevelt was like a left-wing figure. But as World War II is ending, he dies. And then you have McCarthyism, which is basically this anti-communist hysteria whipped up across the United States. But about 1954, 1955, 1956, after the death of Stalin, a lot of the wealthy people in the United States felt like McCarthyism was out of control. The Soviet Union, after the death of Stalin, Khrushchev indicated he wanted to negotiate with the United States, but there were huge sections of the U.S. public that said, we'll never negotiate with the commies. Communism is pure evil, right? You have, at the same time, Yugoslavia has cut ties with the Soviet Union. It's a communist country, but it's cut ties with the Soviets. So the USA is trying to give aid and weapons and funding to Yugoslavia to fight the Soviet Union. But of course, there's opposition. We can't help the communists. They're and that in a lot of ways, the McCarthyism has gotten so extreme, right? And the civil rights movement can't move ahead because they're constantly being communist baited. And so there were sections of the ruling class that started being more open to pushing back against McCarthyism. And actually, William F. Buckley, who was a well-known neoconservative, he started out as a Republican against McCarthyism, and he was on the radio ranting against not only the left, but also against McCarthyism. And on the campuses, there started being funding for like activist groups that would oppose McCarthyism. So the new left kind of emerged in opposition to McCarthyism. And it was loosening up U.S. society, saying that the way to defeat the communists is not to be super authoritarian, but to show that we're better than them. We're going to have more democracy. We're going to have civil rights. We're going to loosen up. We're going to have real free speech. We're going to show that the communist way is wrong and the American democratic way is right. Of course, though, that leads to a huge anti-war movement. That leads to the Black liberation movement taking off. And pretty soon, communism is really popular. Students for a Democratic Society, they're out in the streets. The Black Panthers are out there. And there's
almost as if communism is a good idea.
What's that?
I said it's almost as if communism is a good idea.
Indeed. So there's
strange.
a political crisis. So as Nixon comes in, they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we push back against the new left? The new left has gotten out of control. And Nixon is realizing that younger people in the United States, they're just not interested in religion, right? The young people that grew up watching television, listening to rock and roll music from Elvis Presley and all of that, they are not interested in going to church on Sunday and hearing organ music and hearing a guy read from the Bible. It's not interesting to them. So there starts to be a question, how can the right wing push back against these new left activist groups that have all this power, Students for a Democratic Society and all of this? How do we push back against them? And so they realized there was a faction among the new left activists they called the Jesus people or the Jesus freaks. And they were hippies who were Christians. And so there started to be discussion on the right wing about using the Jesus freaks or the Jesus people as a mechanism for pushing back against the new left.
I see where this is going.
Right. And it started out, there was a guy named Tony Alamo, who was a Beatles record producer in Los Angeles, a record marketing exec. He had an awakening. God spoke to him, and he started his own church, which was hippies. They sang rock and roll on guitars and all of that, but they were super Republican and conservative if you got to know them, right? Reverend Sun Myung Moon, the pastor from South Korea, is imported to the United States, and they start recruiting teenage runaways and other people into this, what they call is a peace movement. But then if you really get to know them,
cult.
It's super anti-communist. Communism is the Antichrist. Reverend Moon is Jesus, the second coming to fight the communists, right? And that
these are the people, the Moonies. They're the ones behind what famous is it, the Washington Times?
Washington Times, New Yorker Hotel. The other thing is that Reverend Billy Graham, who is probably the most famous pastor in recent U.S. history, Reverend Billy Graham, he's Richard Nixon's spiritual advisor. And he starts having rock and roll songs and Jesus freaks perform on his TV broadcasts, right? At the same time, he's advising Richard Nixon about how to escalate the Vietnam War and such. So
it's disgusting.
Right. And what we know as the religious right, which really came to real prominence and power in the 1980s and 90s, especially, and the Bush years was kind of their last hurrah. really starts, the very roots of it are in the Nixon presidency, as kind of figuring out how can we like reinvent Christianity to be, rock and roll, sexy, TV, and get a generation that's grown up watching television and listening to rock music into Christianity to push back against the new left that's out of control. And that's the moment, like 1970, after Nixon has taken office, 1971, that's the moment where these conversations are going on. And it seems like Broadway, they do 2 rock and roll Jesus musicals as kind of an experiment. And they figure probably, okay, this will appeal to Christians, number one, but it'll also appeal to hippies, right? And they're kind of experimenting with this new image of Jesus Christ, the revolutionary. And that's kind of the atmosphere. So that's the political atmosphere. Do you want to say more about Superstar?
Yeah, I mean, well, so first off, Superstar, it's not surprising that it's as dark as it is, because Superstar is supposed to be written from the perspective of Judas. Judas Iscariot, and according to the interpretation, and I've seen this in interviews with Andrew Lloyd Webber and his book writer, I forget the guy who wrote the book.
Tim Rice.
Tim Rice. Tim Rice specifically says he does not believe that Judas thought that Jesus was divine. So if the show is from the perspective of Judas, supposedly, you wouldn't see any of the miracles or any of the actual divinity. But what's interesting is there is no resurrection of Jesus, but there is a resurrection of Judas, where he shows up after he's hung himself in the white with angels and does that really great song where he's saying, if you'd come today, you could have reached a whole nation. Israel in 4 BC had no mass communication. So the play does flirt with supernatural themes, but then also you can't quite tell because of the framing device if he's actually come back or if he's being an actor coming back for a curtain call. And of course, I can't remember if he shows up on the bus on the way back or not, but you do see him after he's died.
Well, neither of the plays actually have a resurrection scene, which is, I think, very important to understanding them. But I want to get to that later after we've talked about both of them, and I can point out the similarity of reasons for that. But Superstar, right? You don't ever see Jesus performing any miracles. And it was super controversial at the time. I mean, wildly controversial, because it portrayed Christ as having a sexual relationship with Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
And that comes across. And that was wildly controversial because, the idea of Christ being a sexual being was just considered to be, wild. But what's interesting, though, is that the Unification Church, the Moonies, that's a big part of their theology. Their entire religion is premised on the idea that Christ didn't complete his mission on earth because he never got married, right? So they see Christ as a sexual being, right? And that's interesting too. And that in Christianity, there's this concept, there's the debates about Christology, I think, and there's high Christology, which is Christ is practically a god. And then there's low Christology, which is this idea that Christ was just a person. And I think that's a controversy among Christians, but at the same time,
because in the West, there's a very strict. This is one of the things that I dealt with by becoming a Buddhist. There's a very strict delineation between the sacred and the profane, and the worldly and the divine, essentially. And I think it goes down to ideas about heaven and about God, like in the scriptures when they say God is holy, holy, holy. They're not saying God is great and awesome and wonderful. They're saying God is other, as in completely removed from this dimension and this reality that we find ourselves in. So when you break the world down essentially into this dualistic idea of the tangible and the I think in the Bible they use it when the tangible has been when the perishable has been clothed in the imperishable, or essentially the part of us that goes on forever and the part of us that dies, and they say that these are different things, and it leads to a very strict way of looking at the world, where you kind of look at the world and you look at it like it is something to be put up with until you die and get to go to heaven. Which I personally think that's not a very good or healthy way to look at anything. And I also think it's had disastrous effects, not just on Christians, but also like Western style atheism that came out of the Enlightenment, because what they did was essentially they cut all of the magic out of the world and said there is no divine, it's just all temporal. And that bleeds right into ideas about empire and toxic masculinity and the idea to conquer. That attitude has inadvertently led to one of the worst aspects of like modern anti-religious or anti-clerical ideology in the West.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that, the only time they even hint at Christ performing miracles in Jesus Christ Superstar is he's mobbed by a crowd of people who want him to heal them. And he runs away from them. And people sometimes read that scene as almost like an Ayn Rand kind of thing. Like Jesus is the great man being mobbed by the inferiors wanting to bring him down. And that like he's being persecuted because he's so great. And that this fight between Christ and Judas Iscariot that's the whole musical. It's them having a big argument the whole time and screaming at each other, basically. And Judas Iscariot was I guess, according to that musical, he was one of Jesus's biggest supporters. And he's disappointed with how things have gone and is just full of rage and anger. Feels like his friend it's about Jesus now. It's not about the movement or about what he stands for. And ultimately sells him out for 40 pieces of silver, feels guilty about it, hangs himself. And Judas is almost really the central character, not Christ. Christ talks, and that many have commented that the words of Christ in Jesus Christ Superstar, he almost sounds like an angsty teenager or something. Like he's constantly saying, nobody cares about me. I'm going to die. You're all going to forget about me. For all you care, my body could be bread, and that Christ is just constantly frustrated with his followers, disappointed in them, and frustrated and wondering if his mission on earth or his teachings are even going to survive his crucifixion, right? Christ seems to be full of pessimism, hopelessness, and darkness, and just feels like everything has kind of gone to waste. And then he ends up being killed, and that's kind of, and that fits. I mean, it's a very, very dark performance, right? I will say, Andrew Lloyd Webber, that is the only Andrew Lloyd Webber musical I can stand. I love the music. I would go to a performance of it again if I had the opportunity. I like it. It's very, very good, but it is a very dark telling of Christ's life. You want to say anything further about it before we move on to Godspell, and then we get to what they have in common and don't?
Absolutely. Well, the things that I'll say about Jesus Christ Superstar, because I saw it as dark, but not overly dark, because there are moments, and I haven't seen the stage play. I've only seen the film. But in the film, they do give glimpses of, when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, there's a whole musical bit where you see basically visions of what is going to happen to Jesus. And looking at that like from the perspective of an artist, that is both very hopeful and kind of amazing, because a lot of the times, like as an artist, what the hope often is that what we will do will impact people and that people will care about it. So like in a way, that scene where Jesus is asking, like, to take this cup away from me, it looks like, and can be interpreted as, he gets a glimpse into the future and sees the impact of what he's done. I think the other thing to remember about Jesus Christ Superstar is it is not just an examination of Jesus Christ. It is an examination of celebrity. Because the whole concept of a superstar was just now like breaking onto the society. We hadn't really had stars like that, and so they were kind of looking back to Jesus as like the world's first celebrity. And so like the scene, for instance, with the lepers and the crowd, I can see that coming from two places. One, I think that may have been a reaction that Andrew Lloyd Webber or Christopher Rice happened to have, just living in New York City and being constantly surrounded by so many homeless people, which is, you and I know, that's really hard to go through. Not as hard as they're having it, but
especially now with the pandemic. I mean, I see so many homeless people now. But go on.
Yeah, no, it's disgusting and terrible. But then like also like, so I think there's that aspect of it. And in fact, I wrote a similar scene into an early draft of my play now novel about the afterlife after all, with a crowd asking for things, and that was both partially inspired by that scene and also partially inspired by my own difficult run-ins with homeless people, where you want to help them, but you really don't have a lot of money, and what are you going to do? So I think that aspect of it, but then also like the aspect of the crowd. So if you think of Jesus as the celebrity, you think of Judas as his best friend who's been with him from before he was famous, and then you look at his 12 his 11 other disciples. All of them are essentially his posse, his crew, if we do like the whole entourage thing. And of
Right.
course, he's frustrated with them and sees them as not really caring about him, because really what they're doing is they're kind of around there for the party, and in fact they all get drunk together. But then there's also the fact that
it's like the Memphis Mafia, right, that
Yeah.
Elvis had. Right, that Elvis had this group of guys he called the Memphis Mafia, who he basically just financially supported. Their only job was being Elvis's buddy. But many people felt like they were kind of exploiting him, and that they didn't really care about him. They just had they were Elvis's crew that he paid to hang out with him, basically.
Yeah.
Go on. I'm sorry, I just couldn't resist bringing that up.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, because that's something that we don't really have. Like, I've had interactions with fans before, people who've been really into my work, and it can be very strange. And I've also seen, like, working with the Crew Shadows, I've seen the way Rogue handles his fans, and he's like really gracious. But people freaking love him, and there's an sometimes almost religious fervor you see out of people when they meet somebody that they really idolize. And they want to touch you, they want to hug you, they want to talk to you and tell you their deepest, most important things, because there's that whole parasocial relationship going on. So I feel like that was what was being talked about, because also at the time, Andrew Lloyd Webber was he had been elevated as a creator, so he had definitely had some interactions with fans. And also, it's important to know that he has some reactionary tendencies. If I'm not mistaken, he flew back. There was some important, very important vote in England. It had I can't remember exactly what it had to do with, but he was part of like the House of Lords, and he flew back from America to Britain to vote against, basically to vote against the working class on this. Like, he literally caught a plane rather than miss this vote to screw with people. The other thing that's important is to note his musical Cats. And I wanted to talk about this before we get into Godspell as well, because this is important to kind of understanding the sort of reactionary underpinnings. Because, when Cats was first being developed on Broadway, and kind of the joke is that it wasn't about anything. They just did a whole bunch of cocaine, and which they probably did, and made this crazy musical about cats. But there a lot more thought actually went into Cats than that, because it's actually based on a series of T.S. Eliot poems that are children's poems, and they're about cats. But the thing about T.S. Eliot is T.S. Eliot was like, if he were alive today, he'd be alt-right.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and he was very racist, very devoted to very specific ways of creating art and of existing. And you can read the message in his poems about cats is essentially a justification of class stratification and of racism and colonialism. And like the big thing in Cats, what Cats is about, and they even have that big line, like, a cat is not a dog. It's everybody stay in your lane, remain in your part of the hierarchy. So you got to think that's the mindset that Andrew Lloyd Webber is coming at the Jesus story from. You have a deeply reactionary guy who is nonetheless a brilliant artist working among very left-wing people, because he's working in the theater, and telling a story about a revolutionary whose divinity he probably doesn't believe in himself, because I don't think him or Tim Rice could have created the thing as they were if they really believed in Jesus. And what we get is Jesus Christ Superstar, which is an amazing mashup of like all of these things coming together. But there is a reading of it, because of its creators, that can be deeply anti-revolutionary at certain times. But also, like with Cats, there are aspects of it's like the work itself takes over and transcends its creators, because Cats, he's trying to tell this, very stodgy, almost British reactionary story, but because of the medium he's working in and the type of artist that he is, there's a lot of modern dance in it. There's a lot of people moving as cats and different. The freedom that they express with their body is in direct contrast to the regimentation that is expressed in the poems and the themes of T.S. Eliot, which the whole thing is based upon.
Well, that's a theme we'll get to when we talk about Godspell, because there's definitely a similar weird dynamic there. But before we move on from Andrew Lloyd Webber, I just want to throw one last thought out there, right? Because I know that Andrew Lloyd Webber didn't come up with the story of the Phantom of the Opera, but I mean, he's an incel. I mean, I'm just saying. I mean, it's like you can't get. He is like the literary incel, right? I mean,
He really
that's
is.
what the Phantom of the Opera is. He's an incel. I mean, he can't get a woman. He's angry about it, so he does some elaborate terrorist attacks and haunts the opera place because he's angry because he's not good looking enough to get a woman. And I mean, right?
I'm pretty sure he wears a fedora.
What's that?
I think in the play he wears a fedora too.
You're supposed to kind of feel sorry for him, right? He's doing all these evil things because he feels like he's ugly, and he's like trying to trap this woman so he can like force her to be his partner against her will. But you're kind of supposed to feel sorry for him, like he's this tortured genius or something. I will say, you know what I mean? I mean, just saying, right? So, I mean, you can't tell me that the Phantom of the Opera is not an incel, right? I mean, if there's any literary character who fits that definition, he does, right?
Oh my God. Yeah. I can't wait for the memes, like when the incel community takes up the Phantom of the Opera.
But moving on from that, so 1971.
I'll be their new Pepe.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
A guy named John Michael Tabellic, who was an Episcopalian, but was also kind of a counterculture enthusiast. He was a devout Episcopalian, but he was also a hippie. He wrote this musical, Godspell, and originally the music was taken from the Episcopalian hymnal, and then a composer named Stephen Schwartz, changed it to a rock and roll theme, and they put it on Broadway. And it comes out, and in a lot of ways, it is completely contrary to Jesus Christ Superstar. Jesus Christ Superstar is extremely dark, right? Whereas Godspell is extremely light. And again, you watch it, and it almost looks like Sesame Street or something. I mean, it is so childish in its religiosity that you almost wonder, is this for adults? It's like the characters are all speaking in childish voices. Now, the way it's normally portrayed, the cast dressed like hippies. However, that was apparently not his intent. He intended for them to be dressed like Harlequin clowns. And he had this...
better that they went with the hippies.
Yeah. And, the Jesus character is slightly effeminate. He wears a Superman T-shirt, and he has a big afro and some, like, clown paint on his face. And he tells little silly jokes, and he's entertaining. And most of the play is Jesus and his followers doing little skits that act out parables, right? Every one of the Jesus parables is acted out in the skits. And the thing is, you were pointing to about the contrast with Cats between, the tone of the story versus the tone. A lot of these parables are very, very dark, actually, and involve people getting tortured and going to hell and all of that. But they're told in this kind of childish, sing-songy, silly way. And that comes across. And I remember when I first saw the play, and I saw it like several times, I saw it when I was a kid. I saw it, one of the local high schools in my area performed it. And I saw it. And again, what I noticed was it seemed like, okay, you just talked about someone getting tortured. You just talked about someone going to hell. You just, but it's like gleeful and silly and childish, right?
Jazz hands.
Yeah, completely. Jazz hands and all of that. The other weird thing about it is, Jesus Christ Superstar is almost entirely about Judas Iscariot versus Jesus and this like personal conflict between the two of them. Well, in this one, John the Baptist and Judas Iscariot are the same character, the same person, right? And John the Baptist shows up at the beginning, and John the Baptist is, in the Christian, narrative is the guy who basically created Jesus. He announced Jesus to the world. He showed up and said, this guy is the Messiah, and he announced Jesus to the world. So at the beginning, John the Baptist announces Jesus, baptizes him. They do a lot of singing. And then at the end, it's John the Baptist or Judas they're the same guy who, persecutes him, and actually they have him actually doing the execution, actually, like, tying him to a fence, like, which is supposed to be the crucifixion. And the official reason given for that, they say, according to John Michael Tabalik, is they said, well, we didn't want to, John the Baptist's role at the beginning was so small, we didn't want to invent a whole nother character. We just felt it was more convenient to do it that way. I think that that's a little bit facetious, honestly. I almost read into this like a kind of like, it's like the Bill Cosby line about, I brought you into this world and I can take you out. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like, you see John the Baptist, which is not in Superstar. They don't show, for John the Baptist is not portrayed. It's, in Jesus Christ Superstar. It's John the Baptist announcing Christ to the world, and then John the Baptist being the one who betrays him and persecutes him. And I feel like that was some kind of statement. It was like, it was almost, back to that theme about celebrities, like the crowd lifts you up and then tears you down. There was a statement intended in that. That was not accidental, right? That was not accidental. What's hiring one extra actor? Do you make a theological, statement like that? Yeah. You know what I'm saying? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think they could have easily split the part into two parts. It wouldn't be. I agree that argument is a bit facetious, but also it makes sense in the sense that, God sent his son to be crucified and murdered by us. And so in a way, you've got John the Baptist as a stand-in for God. I created you, and now I'm going to destroy you as part of this prophecy that I'd created. And like, if people get a chance, and if you're interested in like theology and stuff, there's there's two great debates on my channel that people can look at, that I have with Pastor Mark Tan of Explain Apologetics, which is really funny because like I'm the Buddhist who looks like Jesus and he's the Christian who looks like a Buddhist. And like he and I talked about, we have one about the afterlife and one about like, do I need a savior? Like do we need a savior to pay for our sins was the topic of the second debate that I did with him. And we get like into the weeds on the theology of it and my own views towards this concept and some of his. But like Christianity has this thing where essentially from Christian tradition, before like, and I guess Judeo-Christian tradition, there was the whole concept of the scapegoat, where sin and guilt was abolished by a sacrifice to the gods, where you took a literal goat or similar animal, like out into the desert, you put your sin on the goat and you killed the goat, and now you're absolved. And Jesus was going through that. He was like the perfect sacrifice, the infinite sacrifice, so that he was the sacrifice to end all sacrifices, and thus he's able to take away the sins of the world. So you're seeing through the traditions of the ancient Near East a continuation, but also a way to close that loop and to solve that problem. Because like really it does come down to absolution, and forgiveness is crazy important for humans, because there's always an infinite regress of sins of some humans against another. There's always like people get stuck in like patterns of guilt and revenge, and that there has to be a way to do that. And it can't really be done simply by engaging in reparations or something, or trying to make up for what you're doing, because people are flawed. So if you make a mistake and then try to atone for that mistake, you will find you will make a mistake while attempting to atone for the mistake. And there needs to be a way to get past that. And so that's the way that the ancient Christians solved that problem, by using him as a sacrifice. So it is kind of fitting that John the Baptist, if we put him in the father position, and thus God the Father takes Jesus into the world and takes him out. Now, I don't know if they intended that, but also a lot of the creative process is subconscious, so they may have been tapping into that without realizing it. It also may be that there is a instinctive need when you're telling a story to bookend it. Like, and you've got the prequel, you've got the ending. You really shouldn't just waste characters as a creator. You don't want to just bring someone in and do nothing with them. That it has to pay off, the Chekhov's gun in a way. So it makes sense why they did that from a craft standpoint, but it's also a really weird thing to do.
Well, the other thing, is that John the Baptist, the way it's portrayed generally, the way the play is performed, they're hippies, right? They're hippies. But John the Baptist very much sounds like a hippie. I mean, he wore camel skin all the time. He went around preaching and baptizing people and condemning the rich and powerful. He apparently ate nothing but honey and insects, locusts.
He's a shaman.
Yeah, and he ended up being executed, being killed. And I guess he was beheaded. The story is that the girl danced for the king, and the king was so sexually aroused, he said, "I would give you whatever you want." And so the girl's mother or sister or something like that said to her, "Tell him you want John the Baptist's head." And then John the Baptist was killed. And many people almost see that in the Gospels as foreshadowing the Passion of the Christ, right? Is that like John the Baptist is killed unfairly by the authorities, and it's kind of like hinting that this will eventually happen to Christ as well. But what is also kind of interesting is you mentioned that whole thing about God, God and redemption and all that. There's a Freudian reading of that, which is that that many of the themes in the Christian religion, but also in the Abrahamic religions, are like people dealing with traumatic, horrible things in the world around them. Like many people point to the example of the fact that like at the time of the Roman Empire, ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, infanticide was extremely common. Right? A baby would be born deformed or not healthy enough, or maybe the family couldn't raise it, so they would just dump it in the middle of the desert.
Yeah, exposing a child, which you see a lot of plays. It's interesting that you see that theme so often in plays, because, like, for instance, take Oedipus. The story of Oedipus can be seen almost as a PSA on don't leave your children in the woods.
Right, but in the Christian faith, generally, there's so many stories of abandoned children who don't die and go on to do amazing heroic things, like Moses, for example, right? And it's almost like people, infanticide is this horrendous part of everyday life, and so people have rewritten this kind of story where something good comes out of infanticide, right, or attempted infanticide. And that many people see the story of Christ, that he dies for your sins, as almost like some kind of weird rationalization by a very severely abused child, right? Like the idea is, the child is being very, very harshly punished and abused by their parent, right? But this is done out of affection. So the idea is they invent a parent who is so loving, but has to punish them so harshly that they have their own son take their place out of so much love, and it's like at no point, and the common criticism that atheists will make is at no point is anyone questioning that there has to be horrendous punishment, right? It's just, oh, well, you got to punish Jesus, you got to punish somebody. I mean, there has to be horrendous punishment in the world. So Jesus is this loophole where horrendous punishment can happen, but you don't have to endure it. And people see that as almost like some kind of weird rationalization. When the parent says, "I beat you because I love you," they're writing this weird narrative where the beating must go on, but they're not going to endure it. And people read it that way. But that leads me to, I talked about the childishness of Godspell. And again, it's almost as if, Christ has reduced his followers who are adults to being toddlers. You know what I mean? Like that comes across, right? And that for a lot of people who are, deeply religious, it is a desire to kind of escape from the shades of gray and the scariness of adulthood, where everything isn't a clear case of right and wrong, and there's confusion in the world, and they want to be kids again, where they have parents that are right and there are rules they can follow, and everything's very, very simple. And then that kind of comes across. And in some of the cults that emerged later, right? I mean, we talk about Tony Alamo and the Moonies. There is very much an aspect of age regression in the people that joined those kind of Jesus freak or Jesus people cults of the 70s. It was about regressing them psychologically to make the world less scary. And that in this 1960s and 70s, the world was very scary because all of the McCarthyism was being refuted. America was not the greatest country in the world. It was killing millions of people in Vietnam. It had oppressed black people. And there was this like, oh my God, the world is way scarier than I thought it was when I was a kid. I'd like to regress to this kind of state of childishness where I just follow the leader and there is clear right and wrong and I don't have to worry about all this scary stuff. And I see that. I mean, the age regression that seems to be such a big theme in Godspell. I see that. Can you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that, well, I haven't seen Godspell, so I would have to, if what you're telling me is correct, yeah, I would definitely agree with you on that about this show. I may see it later on and go, oh, no, 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 Caleb, you're totally missing something. But
Sure.
um, the so this is really interesting because this is actually something that I play with Snow White Zombie.
Hmm.
And in fact, I see a lot of like sort of darker and edgier things, like even Batman Begins and The Dark Knight. There is a certain shock that comes in the transition from childhood to adulthood that we all go through. Sometimes people call it getting woke or taking the red pill, and these are ideological ideas about it. They're ways to deal with the shock of leaving from a childlike existence where you don't have as much freedom, but everything is more or less taken care of for you because it's the adults in your life who worry about the problems, assuming you have a functional family. um, and then you get into the real world and suddenly you got to pay rent and you got to do this, and you encounter hordes of homeless people and folks who are diseased. It's very much even goes back to the Buddha story when he goes outside the walls and encounters first a sick man and then an old man and then and then a corpse. When you reconcile with the adult world, there is a incredibly potent disorienting feeling that can happen, and people work through that in a number of ways, and that's why I think like gritty reboots of childhood franchises are so popular. And can be so compelling when they're done right. Also, just like sort of darker and edgier fiction, and how everything has to get really dark and edgy for the people in their 20s to their late 30s until they have a kid, and then they have to kind of chill out and start working on raising the next person, so they go through that whole cycle again. So there is definitely this nostalgic wish to return to where you were in childhood, and a lot of the ways, you can even see some anti-capitalist activism being informed
Yeah.
by this, because there's a lot less anxiety, assuming let's say we did have a fully functional communist society. A huge amount of anxiety would be absolved in and resolved in the average person, because now it's no longer a means of, do I make rent this month? Will I eat? Will I have a roof over my head? The society that we have right now uses that fear and that anxiety to force people into working for capitalists. If you removed that, we might see that the culture changes and maybe we're less interested in these gritty reboots of everything. And maybe we become less interested in certain forms of religion and more interested in other forms of religion. With me and becoming a Buddhist, it's really helped come to grips with a lot of these like very serious, heady questions dealing with life and death and impermanence. And I definitely see, like even with the phrase like "ye must be born again," there's a lot of emphasis. I was in a play called The Great Divorce where I played the voice of God, actually, because
Wow.
it was one of the things in my theater department I was known for. I played Poseidon and God. And because I could, when I want to, I can really do this like big, deep, booming voice. And so like in that, they had a whole line where one of the sinners was being offered a chance to go to heaven, and I think the thing in The Great Divorce is they all refuse for one reason or another, except for maybe one. But they even have that line of like, become that child again. So there is definitely that element of regression in a lot of Christian theology and a lot of Christian tradition.
Indeed. Indeed. So now, one of the things that both of those plays have in common is no resurrection scene. And that's what made them also wildly controversial. And, for Godspell, the argument that they gave, and I think I've even heard that Andrew Lloyd Webber made this argument about Jesus Christ Superstar, is they said, well, the curtain call is the Godspell, or the curtain's call is the resurrection. The curtain call is the resurrection, right? But the thing is, there's a curtain call at the end of Hamlet, and I don't think anyone sees Hamlet as coming back to life. So, I don't quite buy that, right? But they say, no,
Yeah.
no, when the music gets happy again at the end, at the curtain call, that's the resurrection. And I don't buy that. But there's not a resurrection. And there's a couple ways to interpret that, right? I mean, first of all, The fact especially that in the play version of Godspell and in Jesus Christ Superstar, we don't ever see any miracles being performed, right? And there's a whole history of kind of, I guess you could call them pantheist or quote unquote rational Christians who reject the miracles of Christ. In fact, Thomas Jefferson even famously wrote the Jefferson Bible, which was called like the Life and Teachings of Jesus, and he removed all the miracles from it because he said he would preserve Christ's teachings for a more rational age where people no longer believed in miracles, right? And that there's like kind of Unitarians and others who reject the miracles of Christ. So, by not having a resurrection, by also not having any miracles. Now, there's miracles in the movie version of Godspell. Jesus has magical powers and makes things appear out of thin air and stuff, but not on the Broadway stage. And you wonder if there's some of that going on, that like they just, but the other thing is that by doing that, in a way, they made the plays a little more, I guess the term is multi-faith, or is that ecumenical, right? Where, Christians believe Christ was crucified and rose again. Now, there's debate about whether it was a bodily or physical resurrection or a spiritual resurrection only. And that's a whole big debate.
Yeah.
Christ had only 10 appearances after his resurrection, and every time he seemed to appear and disappear, and it's almost like he was a ghost or something. So there's a lot of debate about that in Christianity. But among Jews, right, in Judaism, it's widely understood there was a man referred to now as Jesus who was going around preaching and ended up getting crucified. Muslims also believe in Jesus Christ. They believe he was a prophet. They don't believe he was the Son of God or the Messiah. They believe he was a prophet. They believe he was crucified. And then at the last minute, God switched his body with Barabbas. And so he didn't die on the cross. He didn't rise from the dead. He just never died because God switched him with the guy, with the murderer.
So quick you didn't even notice.
Yeah. And so, to have a musical where Jesus lives and dies, that's pretty much okay with everybody. Even a lot of atheists accept the notion of a historical Jesus. Having Jesus actually rise from the dead at that point makes the play blatantly Christian. Right. And I think that they didn't want to do that. They wanted Jews and Muslims to be able to buy tickets to the movie or buy tickets to the play. They also didn't want to be seen as proselytizing, Christianity as a faith, as much as interpreting the Jesus story in an artistic way, in Godspell, putting a lot of Jesus's parables and stories, before an audience and to music. But I feel like they didn't really want to go that far. And that's probably what may have been going on. What do you think?
I mean, I think Alan Watts mentioned this, philosopher Alan Watts, who was originally a minister, like a Anglican minister. And then he went and studied with the Zen Buddhists, and he kind of mentioned that basically in the modern world, no one actually believes in the resurrection. They think that they should believe. They say that they believe, but they don't really believe. And he gives us his evidence for this, the way that they act towards other people. Because if you actually did believe in the resurrection, you actually did believe in heaven and hell, you'd be acting very differently than most Christians and various other religions actually act in their day-to-day lives. So the idea of like the miracles and the resurrection, it's all ways to kind of deal with this doubt that creeps in. What I find very interesting about it, and this is sort of kind of gets into my own views on this, is when you consider the mystical experience, what Buddhists call satori, or what the Hindus call moksha, where you essentially experience a form of ego death, and it can be attained through meditation, it can be attained through use of psychoactive drugs, and it can be attained through just suddenly out of nowhere for no reason whatsoever. And suddenly you stop thinking of yourself as just you in your body. You're still experiencing everything through your body, but your awareness goes out to more of the oceanic feeling, where you are not just your body, you are literally everything in the world that is simply expressing itself through this particular consciousness right now. And there's been a lot of speculation over, whether Jesus, before he started preaching, had this experience, because there's a number of things that he says that can be read multiple ways. And one of the ways, like when he says, like, I am the way, the truth, and the light, none come through the Father except through me, but also the fact that he said, the kingdom of God is within you and the kingdom of God is within man. And you have Tolstoy saying that the kingdom of God is within you. What he may have been alluding to is this mystical experience, this feeling of connection with everything that there is. And when you see somebody who goes through this, especially if they're coming from like a Western background, suddenly they'll have that experience and they don't have any other way to express it. So they might say, I'm Jesus Christ. And everybody goes up. And of course, in the Christian tradition, there's only one Jesus Christ. So you can't be Jesus and you throw him into a mental institution. But perhaps if he'd come from different traditions, he might have been able to express that feeling and that emotion in a very different, far less inflated way. Because one of the big problems that I find with Christianity is the connection of God with the idea of a sovereign. And, you even see it in church. Catholic churches are based after medieval courts. And everybody goes and you kneel in church. And why do you kneel in church? Because you kneel before the sovereign. Why do you kneel before the sovereign? Because the sovereign is afraid of everybody, that somebody's going to come up and stab them in the back. So they sit in a big throne with their back to the wall and everyone prostrates themselves. And similarly, the priest is up there kind of as like the master of ceremonies, and the sovereign is God and Jesus with his back to the wall. And you even see it with Buddhist statues. There's almost every Buddhist statue that you see seems to be built with their back to the wall. So it's this replication of human political patterns into religion, us understanding religion in the way that we understand politics. And even like Protestants, you'll note that the Protestant churches are oftentimes based on, like, they're based on courts.
Yeah.
And with the priest and the judge in the same position. And I remember even in the Cecily McMillan trial, they talked about how Cecily's lawyer spoke to me about how, the prosecutors thought of themselves like they were doing God's work and bringing, this kind of punishment, that they were God's anointed to do this to Cecily. So there is so much overlap between spirituality and religion and politics, and it can go very, very wrong very, very quickly if people just have the slightly wrong ideas in their head.
Indeed. What I think is interesting about that is you'll notice that, for example, when you talk about Catholics versus Protestants, right? One of the big shifts is the Protestant church is quote unquote democratic in that they elect the leaders, local congregational sovereignty and stuff. And that reflects, a shift, right? And that the Protestant Reformation was the very beginning of the capitalist class breaking feudalism apart and seizing power. The Catholic Church was associated with feudalism. The Protestant church was seen as anti-feudal. And then you have the Protestant work ethic and all these concepts that are much closer to capitalism. Whereas as the Catholic Church argues kind of against some aspects of capitalism, seeing it as inconsistent with feudal values, and that.
By the way, really, to throw something in there, Martin Luther, I remember this from my religious history classes. There was a peasant uprising where they took Martin Luther's name and were like, we're uprising because of Martin Luther, and and Martin Luther actually wrote to the Lord and was like, no mercy for these people, just kill them all, but yeah, there is an inherent tension between the fact that we see the universe, like Christians see the universe as a monarchy, but we are a democracy. Right. Because, obviously, if the universe is monarchical, then how can democracy be the best form of government? And you can also see why, some religious people freak the hell out about communists, because they're really tied into this idea of God the sovereign, God the big boss.
Well, right. And then a lot of, Protestant, sects or religious groups like Quakers talk about the inner light, and it's almost like everyone has their own little piece of God inside of them. And you see an attempt to kind of democratize the concept of God, that the Methodism, everyone must find their own method, that kind of thing. And you see that. What I also thought was interesting, though, is that as far as the resurrection is concerned, that some aspects of the resurrection story itself, as you find it in the Bible, are almost alluding to the fact that it was not a bodily resurrection. I know the Catholic Church regularly points to the fact that it was women who witnessed the empty tomb as proof that Christ had a bodily resurrection. But and they'll say it clearly, it must be true because women couldn't testify in court back then. So that shows that he was not doing it strategically. It wasn't a lie. I think the fact that he appeared to people who couldn't testify in court probably alludes to the fact that they were not in any danger for saying it. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? The other thing is that there's the famous the story where the two disciples are on the road to Emmaus, I believe is the town, and they're walking and they meet a stranger and they talk with him and he's very friendly and he just seems like a great guy. And these are supposed to be two of Jesus's disciples, mind you. And then he comes and he breaks the bread and then leaves. And then they go, I think that guy was Jesus. And it's like these are disciples that would have been able to recognize him immediately. So what was that about? And many people look at that as saying almost like what's being said there is it's like this is somebody who'd come across Jesus's teachings and ideas and understood them and was able to explain them, even though he was a total stranger to the disciples. And that showed that Christ's, teachings had not died, right? And that Christ's ascension into heaven in the book of Acts, where it's like he has 10 appearances and then he ascends into heaven. It's like he's sending his followers on a mission. They gain the ability to speak different languages, and he gives them this like speech about you will go to different towns and all who are persecuted in my name. And it's like, again, it's like the resurrection is that his ideas have become even more powerful. I think about Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Strike me down and I shall become even more powerful than you can imagine. That's what I immediately thought of when I was a kid. When I would read more about the resurrection, I would think this sounds a lot more like Star Wars, right? It's like Jesus is a ghost, but it's like he's more powerful as a ghost than he was as a person or something. It almost comes across
arguably, he probably was, like, as a symbol. There's an episode of the Boondocks it's a real downer, but it's like if Martin Luther King had been shot, and he comes out of the coma and then is suddenly hit with like the actual culture that we have, and he's like on a talk show and people are being like, people like the kind of people you see in the media. So like, I think, in a way, by becoming a martyr, it kind of solidifies that symbol in the minds of people in a way that having Jesus the man simply didn't, So I think there is something to be said about that. But also, when you remove the human element and you move too much into Jesus the symbol, then you run into the problem of people projecting onto Jesus whatever they want.
The other thing is that I feel like, the fact that they have Christ in both musicals and he doesn't get resurrected, but he does get martyred. I mean, he does get killed in a very painful way. That is kind of a blow at postmodernism and the new left, not at like Marxism and the old left, but at the new left, which is starting to say things like there is no truth, everything's a matter of competing narratives. There's nothing really worth dying for, is kind of a theme that you get from the postmodern new left coming at that time. And it's like they're saying, look, Jesus, this figure that everyone's worshipped, is somebody who believed in something and believed in it so much that he died for it. That is seen as in a way as kind of a subtle blow at some of the philosophical stuff that was going on with the Frankfurt School and some of that. And it's almost kind of introducing the idea that yes, there are things that are worth dying for. And Christ, who Christianity has had a huge impact on world history, as somebody who sacrificed and gave his life for something, and that it kind of speaks to this kind of a lot of the 1960s pessimism is starting to lead to communism and capitalism are both the same. There really is no truth in the world. There's really nothing worth going and getting shot over. People need to just chill out and use drugs and stop being so uptight. And, the Jesus narrative is a pretty big slap in the face to that kind of thinking, right? Not the organized Marxist left, mind you. They're all about martyrdom and sacrifice and all of that. But the the postmodernism and the pessimism that you find from that era.
Well, yeah, and of course, Marxism and anarchism, they're all modernist ideas. And the postmodernists, I think there was definitely something to the postmodernists, but I think also there is something that I find deeply irritating about postmodernism, and I think it is the sort of total rejection of most of everything. I don't know. I had a great conversation with 5x5 after my debate with Sargon, and we talked a bit about, and then a little later I went on his podcast. We talked about J.K. Rowling. I actually brought up our podcast about J.K. Rowling, and he mentioned that I really need to read Adorno. So now I think I might have to read Adorno.
Okay. Well, the other thing I might want to add is that, as you look at, I think Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar were huge boosts to the Jesus freaks and the Jesus people, which eventually evolved into the religious right? Mm-hmm. And that what kind of became the defining thesis of the Jesus people as you get through the 70s, right? And you have the rise of different groups like the Moonies and Tony Alamo, and Billy Graham becomes more popular. And then finally, in like the late 70s, you have the Moral Majority and Jerry Falwell, and you have the rise of the mega churches and the evangelicals that kind of defined politics up until like the Obama years, that were like the most powerful political force in the country. I mean, many people didn't like them, but in terms of power of all political movements, they had the most devoted followers. They had the ability to get the most done.
And they're still kind of, they're still backing Trump and
Mike Pence, I think, and their excuse for supporting Trump, even though he's clearly not somebody that a devoutly religious person could admire, they compare him to King Cyrus, who despite not being a Christian or whatever, allowed Israel saved the Jews or something like that, right? And they say that Trump is, for his own selfish reasons, doing God's work. Like that's the analogy you'll hear on Christian television.
Which is, by the way, the dumbest freaking thing I've ever heard in my
life. But the biggest, the theme that you saw in 1970s Jesus people and all of that was they started to really emphasize the idea that communism was the main enemy. Not because communism was so evil and wrong, but because communism offered heaven on earth, offered racial equality, offered justice and kindness and a world without cruelty, without God, right? And that becomes a big theme among the Jesus people and all of that in the beginnings of the religious right. And it's a very strange kind of logical leap, right? And this is a very common theme with a lot of like very, very anti-communist socialists. Like a lot of the neocons were originally Trotskyists who didn't like the Soviet Union, didn't like Stalin or whatever. And so even up into the 80s, they're still calling themselves socialists, but they're campaigning for Ronald Reagan. And it's like we believe in socialism, but fake socialists in quotes, are more dangerous than American capitalism and imperialism, right? And it's kind of like, that's kind of the same logic you get with the Jesus people. We're trying to build heaven on earth. We're trying to build a spiritual community. We're trying to share all things in common and all of that. But these communists think they can do it without God. So they're more dangerous. They're appealing to the same things we're appealing to. The same anger at modern man, the same all of that, but they're doing it with this godless ideology. So we need to team up with all these capitalists and people that are, really, really not in line with what we believe and teach at all, because we need to get rid of this main enemy, communism, the theme of communism being the Antichrist, because communism offers building God's kingdom on earth without God. That is a huge theme with those people. And it's weird because in the 1960s, the Jesus people were very much part of the left. They were Christians who went to civil rights rallies, who marched against the Vietnam War, and tried to combine being a leftist with their Christian faith. But throughout the 70s, they come to the conclusion that if you really want to think that way, you have to be a Republican and a raging anti-communist, which I find fascinating.
Yeah. It's, it's kind of mind-blowing because religion so often is used to organize people, and it can be such a powerful organizational tool, and can be terrifying in the wrong hands. What I've found very interesting about religious organizing and about seeing and not even just the negative stuff, like Soka Gakkai is a great example. My Buddhist organization, I really like what they do, but there is definitely something to when a religion organizes you towards a purpose. oftentimes the religion tends to offer something really good, like either salvation in the next world or happiness in this world or success. And oftentimes one of the biggest problems I find with the modern secular left is whether you're doing the anarchist or the Marxist, you're probably going to lose. Everything is awful, and you know what, let's just all sit here and wallow in our misery of how oppressed we are.
Yeah.
And it oh, it's just like, you just wonder if some of these people just do they wheeze when they sit when they sit down in a chair. Like, is there just a
well, and that the dialectical materialist worldview, right, is very dark. I mean, it's change comes through conflict, change comes through struggle, change comes from confrontation, right? And that, Buddhism seeks to have harmony in the universe and bring everything into one. But Marxists, if you read, classical Marxist philosophy, right, everything is constantly changing, and it's the contradiction, it's the clash that drives history together. So you want to be as confrontational as you can. You want to never have peace with anything. You want to, and it's that aspect that gives Marxism a kind of violent, and angry vibe. But that very much fits the revolutionary intelligentsia. Let's remember, Marxism started in the aftermath of the French Revolution. It was very much the ideology of people sitting in pubs. And think about Les Miserables and Do We Hear the People Sing? It was people sitting in pubs going, hey, we had the French Revolution and we still haven't created a just society. Where do we go from here? What's the next move? And you have the Hegelians, and then Marx is one of the left Hegelians, and they come to the conclusion, well, there's this economic issue and we need a new revolution to empower the proletariat. But it comes out of that kind of dark change comes through violence and confrontation worldview that I think in some ways has cursed Marxism, right? And that Trotsky's falling out with Stalin was over the question of permanent revolution, where Stalin is saying, we're not going to have revolution in the West, so we need to build a prosperous society in the Soviet Union. Trotsky is saying, oh no, it doesn't matter until the West is seized by communism, there's no hope anyway. So we just have to have the Soviet Union be a temporary holdout in a global civil war to tear down all of Western capitalism. And Stalin has the support of the Russian population that have had the Russian Civil War and blockades and all of that. And they're saying, let's sign some treaties with the West. Let's build our own industries and let's not do this. And that Trotsky was very much sticking to the mindset of the revolutionary intelligentsia. And that leads me, honestly, as much as I've studied, and I think dialectical materialism is in many ways correct, it leads me to the question of if you look at the left, why are there a million factions? Why can't anyone ever get along on the left? Well, because change comes through struggle, Brent. We got conflict, we got a clash, right? What you're going along with somebody you disagree with? That's not dialectical. There is this very, very negative confrontational attitude about the world that the left really kind of cultivates, and I think it comes out of the revolutionary intelligentsia of Europe.
That's fascinating, and it's nice to just see and place this, kind of within because, coming into activism, when I did, without having the historical balance of it with you kind of look at these people and you're like, why are they acting this way? But then, hearing about, it's one of the reasons I really appreciate you as a thinker, and because you do have this background and this understanding of the history of the left that allows us to place ourselves on a timeline. I also find, it seems sometimes that's one of the things that a lot of people on the right are heavily objecting to in their own kind of very wrong and I guess misinformed way. Like, they've only heard half the conversation. Like, you'll notice a lot of the time they get super mad about critical theory, which is so weird because, when you're doing street activism, critical theory isn't a huge part of it. Critical theory is, there's some academics over here talking to you. There's some college students and some weird people that are very interested in it. And then other people are like, hey, let's throw a brick. And then some other people are like, no, let's sit down and talk about this. I think a lot of what happens is people just get really, I feel like they get stuck in their egos and in their own limited perspectives, and they're not able to look at the bigger picture. And so they become obsessed with one or two tactics or one or two groups, and it causes this kind of hyper tunnel vision where you miss everything around you.
Well, and the other thing I would just mention, because I mean, this is a wide-ranging conversation. We're talking a lot more than 1970s,
Yeah.
which is fine with me. But you know, the Christianity and the role it played in the Roman Empire is really wild if you think about it, right? Because Christianity started out as a religion of the Roman proletarians, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that, you know, Rome was the first society in history to have unemployment, right? There was no unemployment in slave societies because everyone was a slave or a master. So, but Rome, you had proletarians, people that were neither slaves nor masters, had no property, who sold their labor power. That's where the word proletarian comes from. It referred to a class in Rome of propertyless free men, right? A lot of whom were Jewish people from Palestine, a lot of Greeks as well, but you know, craftsmen from Palestine who were bricklayers or pipe fitters or whatever, had particular skills, would move to Rome. They'd be hired, but if they couldn't work, they couldn't eat, right? And that was a class. And then you had homeless people, particularly homeless children, all over Rome. And so the Christian faith became a religion, you know, that built orphanages and cared for people and preached this kind of like kindness and stuff that was kind of lacking in Roman society. And Jews were a big section of the Roman proletariat. So, you know, Christianity, a religion that followed a Jewish prophet, a Jewish Messiah, you know, really fit in. But of course, the Romans persecuted it. They saw it as a movement of the proletarians possibly trying to rebel. You know, you have strikes among the proletarians in Rome, for example, strikes led by Christians, because that's the organized group of proletarians, right? And that Christianity is seen as almost kind of a revolutionary movement within the city of Rome against the Roman government. They're persecuting them, they're feeding them to lions or whatever. But as Rome is declining and declining and declining, Christianity gets more and more popular, and it continues to get more and more popular, right? And it later becomes kind of an expression of Roman Stoicism, right? And the belief that there's more to life than pleasure, a rejection of the hedonism of Roman society, and it becomes a lot more than just the religion of Jewish proletarians. It becomes the religion of all kinds of people in Rome. And
yeah,
then,
fun fact, by the way, the Stoics, the original Stoic communes, that was what those evolved into Christian monasteries.
I believe it. And then, you know, finally you have Constantine, who's you know, I mean, he has a dream, and in the dream the cross appears in the sky, and the voice of God tells him, "Under this sign ye shall conquer." And so he wakes up and announces Rome is converting to Christianity. So the very empire it's formed to combat adopts at the last minute, and that is almost simultaneous with Rome's complete dissolution. So it's like, you know, whatever that voice was in the dream of Constantine was lying to him, because it should have said, "Under this sign ye shall crumble," because it was like, I mean, it was, and that's like a big problem for Christian theology. The whole book, City of God, is written to try and explain to people, because many of the people that the early Christians are trying to convert say, wait a second, the Roman Empire used to be the biggest empire in the world, and then they did the whole Christian thing and they fell apart. Not for me. I'm going to go with something else. It was a big problem for them. So St. Augustine is writing this book trying to explain why Rome fell, even though it became Christian, and it's the City of God, and it's one of the key texts of Christian theology. And it's wild, and it's like, you know, Rome on its last breath, you know, is announcing, okay, guess what? We're Christians now. And then we understand it wasn't just the dream that Constantine had. His mother apparently was a secret Christian, and had been attending Christian services and all of that. So she had told him stories of Jesus as a child or whatever. He ended up being the emperor, and he said, you know what, why don't we try this? And I'm the emperor now, so I can declare Christianity's good. And so he, you know, that's really what it was about. But it was, the Christianity was so widespread, and it was officially an anti-Roman doctrine. But Rome as a society was in so much decay that a religion they had tried to suppress was so widespread, even among the richest people, that they finally just threw in the towel and said, okay, fine, we're Christians now. It's pretty wild. And then it's because of Christianity in Rome that it became a global religion, right? If Christianity had just stayed in Palestine, it probably would have faded away. If Christianity hadn't gotten taken to Rome by Jewish craftsmen, right? If they hadn't moved to Rome and started fixing the pipes and doing things in Rome as skilled craftsmen and made it the religion of the proletariat, Christianity probably would have died away. But they were at the center of power, which was Rome, and then Rome spread it all over the world. And that's why we have Christianity. I think it's the biggest religion in the world today, if I'm not mistaken, right?
It is. Yeah, it goes, I think the size of the religions goes Christianity, Islam, Hinduism. I think Buddhism is fourth.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I might have Islam. I can't remember which is bigger, Hinduism or Islam. I think Islam is bigger, larger, but Hinduism is, I think, the third largest and the oldest religion in the world.
Yeah. So I mean, it's pretty wild. But yeah, you wonder, the people in the audience when they went to those 1970s performances of Godspell and Jesus Christ Superstar, did they have any clue what was coming? The rise of Jerry Falwell, the rise of Ronald Reagan, the rise of the religious right. Did they have any idea? I mean, a lot of the people that went to see those musicals thought they were being edgy and kind of rebelling because it's Jesus with rock and roll, when most Christian denominations were condemning rock and roll music and all that. But they were at the very beginning of something that was almost the antithesis of what they were about, right? I mean, the people going to those musicals were young people who, protested the Vietnam War, protested for civil rights, thought that America wasn't so great after all, and Jesus, having a musical with rock music about Jesus, was almost a way of rebelling against Christianity. Yeah. But it ended up giving birth to a resurgent right-wing extremist Christianity that gripped the United States up into the Bush administration, right? And had a lot of power. And they were at the very beginning of something that was the opposite of what they believed.
It almost reminds me, and this is another famous musical from that period, it almost reminds me of Hair. Because have you seen Hair?
Yes, and Hair was a big influence on Jesus Christ Superstar, apparently. But go on, please explain. Yeah.
But the whole process of Hair, is like, the whole story of it is there's this hippie who's not, he keeps saying, like, I'm not going to join the military. I'm not going to join the military. And by the end of it, he's cut his hair and joined the military and is going off to fight and presumably die in Vietnam. So it begins with the dawning of the age of Aquarius and all this great hope for the future. And then this is pushed into, it's the society taking the individual and regimenting them and making them essentially into a slave,
Right, and he spends the play, saying he's not going to do it, like he's going to burn his draft card. And then we find out later it's actually his library card. He didn't burn his draft card, and it's like, will I be brave enough to not go into the military? And then he does, and he takes LSD. There's a big LSD trip, and he has sex with his girlfriend, and it's and it's supposed to represent young Americans that are at this precipice where it's like they don't want to go along with the man or the system, but they end up doing it anyway. And then it's like he dies, right? I mean, as he comes back to the stage dead, almost like Jesus at the end of both of, it's like, he's brought onto the stage dead, almost as a messianic figure.
I forgot about him coming back on. Thank you for that image again.
They bring him back onto the stage. They bring Claude, I think, is the hero of Hair. He walks back onto the stage like they're carrying him on their shoulders, almost the way at the end of Godspell Jesus is carried off, the same way by the cast on the shoulders of the disciples. So it's pretty weird.
It's interesting too that we keep telling stories like this. One of my very first professional gig was in a play called Tecumseh, about the Native American. He wasn't really a chief.
It was an outdoor drama, right?
Yeah, it was an outdoor drama.
I swear, I saw you on stage as a child, but go on. Okay.
It wouldn't have been as a child because I was older, but
right.
yeah, because you're from Ohio. Because it's done like on a mountain, 2,000-seat theater, stage cut right into the mountainside, and like people from all over Ohio, and actually the Shawnee, the remaining of the remnants of the Shawnee tribe, come from like freaking South Dakota to see it every year. And it's one of the few places where like some of their important cultural things, like the wolf dance, are actually preserved on stage by that production, because the U.S. government believed that the way to conquer a people was to destroy their culture. Right. It's one of the reasons why the tribe still supports the show. But like in Tecumseh, it ends with him because he kind of tried to bring together all of the Native American tribes into one nation to oppose the white man, and almost succeeded. Like, he gave this whole prophecy about like a huge earthquake that was going to happen. And when it happened, all tribes were needing to converge on Tippecanoe and become the heart of the new Indian nation. And soon-to-be President William Henry Harrison goaded his brother, Tenskwatawa, into attacking the United States troops, which allowed them to attack and burn the village. Part of this religious revival that had been created was, one, any chiefs that opposed him, they would have accused of witchcraft and killed. But what Tenskwatawa had said to the Indians supposedly was that if you could hear my drum, the white man's bullets will bounce off you. And and the Indians like charged the American troops. And if you go by like attrition, the Native Americans won that battle so many times over. But the fact that they found out that they died from getting shot, and the fact that the Americans were able to break through the lines and burn the village, suddenly they're like, oh, wait, this guy isn't magic after all. Why are we following this whole thing? And they splintered off again. Now, the funny thing was the earthquake that Tecumseh predicted happened. It shook the entire, like, forests fell, lakes appeared where no lakes were before, and some of the tribes who had not known about what happened to Tippecanoe actually showed up to fight with Tecumseh later on, but it just wasn't enough, and he wound up joining the side of the British in the War of 1812 and was killed fighting in Ontario. At the end of the play, it has us carry him off the stage. I was one of the people that had to carry the guy playing Tecumseh, and there was the whole prophecy that in their darkest hour, Tecumseh would return. So in a lot of ways, he as a figure is kind of like the Indian Jesus. And I don't know if that they were specifically pulling from that mythos and creating their own Christ figure, or if this is just a story that humans constantly tell about the people, the great martyrs for various peoples. But I find that theater keeps telling this story, and that people keep telling it, and we keep seeing this kind of process dramatized to be incredibly compelling. And in a way, that's what went in and informed my play Berserker, because Berserker is all about, it's the end of the Viking Age. The Viking king Olaf Tryggvason has been converted to Christianity, and he is waging a war on the remaining tribes to convert them all to Christianity and unify them under his rule.
Right. Well, the lead up to the massacre at Wounded Knee was, maybe 100 years later, but it was like the same story, right? It was the ghost dance revival movement, and the white people being very afraid of the ghost dance revival movement, and then supposed to be a negotiation that ends up just turning into a massacre. And it seems like, despite the fact that the Native Americans, were just being pushed back further and further and didn't have a chance, there was always this like underlying fear among the white settlers that somehow the Native Americans were going to get together and actually pull this off and win, right? And that we have to stop them before they do that, and that there's going to be some kind of Native American Jesus that's going to show up and do magic and drive all of us away, and we won't see it coming. And it's like you almost feel like the white settlers were more afraid of a Tecumseh or a Crazy Horse, and actually had more faith in his supposed magical powers than some of the Native Americans did, right? It was like, and people say that like that's a weird like subconscious aspect of the first world and settler colonial society. So many horror movies, for example, seem to feature somebody from the country that's being colonized, or the area that's being colonized, coming back and killing the white people in the homeland. Dracula, at the time that Britain is colonizing and exploiting the peoples of Eastern Europe, the story of Dracula. So
somebody from Eastern Europe coming,
this monster from Eastern Europe comes back and is drinking the blood of white women in London.
It's something almost primal in the mind, because you when you talk to if you wind up ever, and I don't recommend it, but if you ever wind up talking to like a freaking neo-Nazi, or even not even just a neo-Nazi, somebody who has a reactionary worldview, there is this insane fear that the people, that if we stop abusing these people, they will just come back and abuse us.
Right.
And, my answer to that is always, well, I don't think that's going to happen. But if that happens, I suppose we deserve it, and like, it's better to, if you are so terrified to cease your evil, that evil might be done to you, then you deserve to have that evil done to you.
Sure. The phrase black supremacy comes up when you study the history of American populism, because populism started out as an anti-racist movement after the Civil War. It was the Republican Party, the small farmers, the labor unions, continuing the progressive Lincoln tradition, but gradually it became more and more racist. And as it was racist, all of a sudden they're not talking about white supremacy; they're talking about black supremacy. And it's like, oh, there's going to be black supremacy, and it's like this fear of black supremacy in the 1890s was like a central part of populism becoming more and more right wing and eventually joining the Democratic Party, the Dixiecrats.
And how many people tried to, especially early on, they're not so much doing it now because they realize how idiotic it is, but how many people said when Black Lives Matter first started, tried to act like Black Lives Matter was the same thing as the KKK?
Yeah, right. And it's this really bizarre. And, I remember when I was in college on my campus, there was a Black Student Alliance. And I remember, my college had a very, very low number of African-American students. But I do remember, sitting, at my job, I worked at like the rec center. Then I remember sitting there and there was one of the Black students is sitting there talking to one of the white students. And the white student says to them, "Why do you have to call your club the Black Student Alliance? That sounds like the military or something. Like you're going to get together and kill all white people." And she says, "Well, it's just an alliance. You can have alliances in sports and, and it's like, well, it sounds military to me. That sounds, it's just like this. They're looking for it. You know what I'm saying? If someone called a group of Christian denominations the Christian Alliance, no one would think they were going to be violent, It's pretty sad. It really is. But yeah, no, I mean, I do think that those particular musicals were very, very weird because it was the beginning of the blowback against the New Left. But it was like the New Left kind of identified with it. What I also find is amusing is that, the way that in the 70s, performing a musical with rock music about Jesus Christ was edgy and rebellious. And nowadays, the people who go and see those musicals tend to be evangelicals, right? When they do a Broadway revival, buses full of evangelical kids from the Midwest come and watch it. And it's a musical about Jesus. And it's great, they've totally changed their character. But it kind of parallels the way when Abby Hoffman wore an American flag T-shirt in the 60s, that was edgy, right? It's like, hey, he's being sarcastic. He's wearing. Nowadays, if someone walks around in an American flag T-shirt, they think, oh, he must be a right-wing guy. You know what I mean? He must be ultra-patriotic or something. It's like these things that the context is everything, right? That it was illegal. It was considered flag desecration at one point to wear an American flag. Now it's actually, if someone wears an American flag, they're probably saying I'm right-wing. They're going to be wearing a MAGA hat on top of their shirt, And it shows that these things, the context is everything, right? I would say that probably the majority of the people that perform and watch Jesus Christ Superstore or Godspell now are doing it from like a right-wing evangelical perspective. There need to be more plays about Jesus. There needs to be the Bible more in society. They don't.
We need to go. Everybody needs to see The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. That kind of thing.
Yeah. And
which does show the resurrection, by the way, like really fast. I remember when I saw that. I saw that like in the Deep South. Well, not the Deep South. I saw it in like the Bible Belt. And I remember when Jesus shows up at the end, like literally just like everybody was clapping and I was like, okay, you guys know it's a movie, right?
Well, and also isn't that a little bit like, you don't, you clap, when your favorite sports team wins. You don't clap when the Son of God rises from the dead. That's like a sacred occurrence. You know what I'm saying? Like it's not a parlor trick. Even that just kind of sickens me because it kind of cheapens the do you know what I'm saying? Like I just can't imagine myself applauding for Jesus's resurrection, right? I mean, it's supposed to be this deeply spiritual event. It's not supposed to be, hey, Superman just won the bet. Even that just shows kind of what the beginning of Godspell was. It was making Christianity into a rock concert. It was making Christianity, it was kind of what religious people were critiquing about those musicals at the beginning has kind of become dominant among evangelicals.
So they were right, is what you're telling me.
One thing though that I do remember is, one of the performances of Godspell I saw was in the area that I grew up in. One of the evangelical Christian high schools in my area performed it. So I went with a couple of friends and we saw it. And that, one of the songs in Godspell called The Light of the World, the chorus of it is, it has the refrain, "We all need help to feel fine. Let's have some wine." Right. And it's supposed to be that they're celebrating. Yeah. And then you're supposed to then take communion during the intermission. Right. And it's let's have some wine. But these folks were evangelicals, so they couldn't say, that
let's have some
alcohol
wine
was not okay. So they changed it. I remember they're singing, "We all need help to feel fine. Let's have a good time." And I remember sitting there and like hitting myself on the head, like that's not how that song goes.
That's not the line.
Like just cracking up about like, And again, it's like
Do you ever hear the joke, by the way? It's never go fishing with an evangelical. He'll drink all your beer and then say he didn't.
Oh, that's awful. All right. Well, it's been fun, Brent.
Yeah.
It really has been. This has been a great, wide-ranging conversation, and I can't wait to get this up on the web and see what our respective groups of fans think of it. So thank you very much. Always a pleasure to interact with you.
Absolutely. This was terrific. I will see all you guys, and keep an eye out. It's looking like we don't have everything down, but if everything goes, I'm going to be debating rationality rules on free will. And that should be happening within the next month or so. And I'm really excited about it because he's a real sharp guy, and I think it's going to be the biggest challenge I've had yet.
Yeah, I don't think Will should be in prison. Free will. Oh, that's not what you meant. Huh? I'm just kidding. Okay.
That's really funny. I'm going to have to tell that joke. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, you can use that. I give you permission to use the free will joke.
Yeah. That goes up there with the that and the free Tibet, and you see Peter Griffin on the thing go, "I'll take it," and then he calls China. I've got something you want. Yes, that's right. All the tea. It's going to cost you all the tea in China. All right. So I will catch you guys. I will catch you later. This has been wonderful. And we've gone for an hour and a half right on the dot.
All right. Very good.
All right.